What's up guys, Connor from T-sportline. Today we're going to be installing the Koni Comfort Tune struts on this customer's Model Y. This customer has a pretty cool overland build on his Model Y and he wants a little bit more of a comfortable ride when he's hitting the trails, so these Koni shocks will do just that for him. Kit contents are going to include a front pair of struts and a rear pair of struts, as well as a bump stop washer for each one and a nylock nut for each strut. The tools needed for this job are going to be a 3/8 torque wrench and a 1/2 inch torque wrench, a 1/2 inch socket wrench, a 3/8 socket wrench, and a 1/4 inch socket wrench, a T50, 10 millimeter, 12 millimeter, 13 millimeter, 15 millimeter, 17 millimeter, 18 millimeter, and 21 millimeter sockets will all be used. A 6-inch 1/2 inch drive extension and a 3-inch 3/8 drive extension are useful. A pocket screwdriver, a couple of trim tools, and a 21 millimeter wrench. You will also need a couple of impacts, a 3/8 and a 1/2 inch, as well as a 21 millimeter socket for your lug nuts and a 17 millimeter socket for your shock hat bolts. We've got a swivel here for our spring compressor setup. A spring compressor will also be needed. Most auto parts stores will provide a loaner set or a set to be purchased. Additionally, anti-seize lubricant and a rag will be useful. To start us off, we're gonna pull our front cowl here, which is just held in by a bunch of trim clips, pretty much the whole perimeter of the cowl piece. And then if you have a HEPA filter installed on your car, you will also need to pull the front trunk box itself and then the HEPA filter, as it blocks access to the shock tower on the passenger side. As you can see right here, so this is your passenger shock tower. As you can see, we're going to be pulling these 3 bolts here, and our HEPA filter blocks access to this back one and the front one here. So we'll be pulling our HEPA filter and the front trunk. So first step to pulling our front trunk assembly is going to be popping this front panel out of the way. And we need to be mindful of the emergency release button here for the frunk. So we're just going to stick our trim tool up top here and pop straight out. Should be 3 clips, just like that, and it will slide up and pivot out. And there's going to be 4 tabs, 2 on either side. We're going to push those in towards the light. As we push with our thumb, you should start popping it out, and it will push through the panel, just like that. And then we can pivot it at an angle back through, set this to the side. Next, we're going to need our 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10 millimeter socket, and we're going to remove these 2 front bolts and these 2 10 mil head bolts at the bottom of the frunk. Our front trunk will just pop up and out of the way. There are a couple clips around the outside, so we can just give it a little tug. And before we come all the way out, we need to remove our washer fluid fill here. We're going to remove this clip on our washer reservoir. Next, we're going to unhook the washer fluid hose running up to the cowl, and then grab your washer fill neck and just kind of go side to side and just slot right out. There's nothing holding this thing in here. And then we're going to take our rag and just put it in that hole there, just so no debris falls in there, jams up our pump. Now we've got access to our HEPA filter, so we're going to remove these 2 10 mil head bolts on either side, and your HEPA filter will just slot straight out. 2 tabs right here that you'll have to pick up over before you can slide it out. Now that we've got full access up top, it's time to move down below. Let's go remove our wheels. So I've got my 1/2" impact here with a 21mm socket to knock these wheels off. Now a tire iron will work to do this if you're working off jack stands at your house, but do remember to crack your lug nuts loose before you jack the car up, as you will struggle to get these nuts loose if the car is in the air. Now that we have our wheel off, there's a couple small things we need to get out of the way to make sure we don't damage anything once we pull this shock out. First thing is going to be your brake line. There's a little bracket on the back that holds it to the upright. We need to pull that so that we don't kink our brake line or damage anything. And then we're going to remove these 2 clips and our speed sensor. All right, next step is going to be removing our end link from the shock itself. So you're gonna take your 18mm, get it on there, and this thing is really tight. There is a Torx cutout in this stud in case your ball joint on the back of your end link is spinning and doesn't want to break free from the nut. You can put a wrench on this and then put your T30 socket in there. And we'll just pull him up out the way. So next we're gonna remove this bolt going through the top of our knuckle here that holds our upper control arm in. Now your ball joint on your upper control arm is notched to be able to accommodate this bolt. So this upper control arm will not pop out until this bolt is fully clear. So you're gonna take your 15mm socket and your T50 and just bust this thing loose. And then you may need to apply a little bit of force upwards on the knuckle. A floor jack or a friend may be useful to do this. Just a little bit of pressure up on that. There we go. There we go. Now we're going to loosen up the bolts on the top hat of our shock. Now this car has our 2-inch lift puck kit installed, so we will be using a 12mm socket. However, if you are still riding on your factory suspension with your factory top hat setup, you will be using a 13mm socket. We're just gonna crack these loose, back them up a little bit. We don't wanna take them all the way out just yet, as our shock and suspension arm assembly will drop down. And we want these to be the last thing that comes out. All right, and now we'll remove our lower shock bolt. We're gonna take our 21s and knock our lower shock bolts loose here. And you will need to provide a little bit of upward pressure on your upright in order to get this bolt out. Use a wrench as a pivot. I want to keep my jack up under here when I unbolt my top hat bolts so my shock doesn't fall completely out. We just want to provide a little bit of tension on the shock, and then I'm going to remove our shock top bolts fully. And because this car does have a lift, these are now bolts. On a factory setup, this would be nuts. I like to keep a hand on my shock when I lower my jack here, just so nothing bounces around crazy like. You're gonna pull our upright to the side and then push your upper control arm up, and it may be useful to have a second set of hands to do this. On a stock car, you will have a little bit more clearance than what we have currently with the lift pucks in place. we go, the shock is out. Pivot it up and pull it out. So this is our lift spacer here. Without this, the shock would come in and out of that a little bit easier, just because it has a little bit more clearance on the top end. So we're gonna take this over to our spring compressor and swap all of our factory components onto our struts. So I've got our spring set up and our spring compressor here. Now this thing is pretty fancy, a little bit bigger than anything that you'd be able to find at an auto parts store. Now the auto parts store ones are going to work very similar. Instead of it being a 3-prong setup like we have here, it'll be 2 prongs, and you will just run one side up and then the other side up and kind of walk it up until the spring is fully compressed. Now, once you have your spring compressor on, we're going to compress our spring. And once these get pretty close to about a little less than a finger width that you can get in there, that's going to be your good stopping point. So we're going to pull this little rubber lid off the shock. We will be using that again. And then I've got my 17 mil socket here, and we are just going to buzz the top nut off. There's our nut. And our upper hat should just pop right off, just like that. And then we are going to pull our shock out from the bottom. A little stuck on there from being old. And then we'll just bring this thing straight out the bottom, and your rubber boot and bump stop are not going to come out of the bottom easy, so they can just kind of sit there in the spring still. So this is gonna be your old shock. It's got this rubber pad on the bottom of it. We will be swapping this over to struts. So there are 3 of these little tabs poking through, and we will just push those back through one at a time. And then pull it off, and we will have to kind of stretch our pad over the factory plastic retainer for the boot. And we will not be reusing the factory boot retainer. There we go, right off. Set this aside. Please dispose of this carefully and responsibly, as it does contain pressurized gas. So slipping our rubber boot on, it does have a little indent right here that'll line up. And then we'll just pull our little tabs through until she's sitting flush. And these can just be pulled through by hand, a little bit of persuasion on the top side, and you're good. And then we're gonna slot this in. Now it's good to note the positioning of your sway bar tab on the shock is going to be slightly to the left of the long side of your top hat. So if you look at your top hat here, you're gonna have 2 bolts that are closer together, and then the one by itself. See that this distance here is going to be longer than this distance. So these 2 are going to go towards the rear of the vehicle, with the one going towards the front. So we're going to line this guy up with your tab. So that it's roughly about there. So back into the compressor. We're gonna slot our shock in, make sure we get our rubber boot and bump stop on the shaft before we get too far up. And then we're going to get our nut started. And these guys up top are going to be a little tricky to get started, but once you get started, you're good, and you can release the bottom. So now we're going to sit here and position our hat right where we wanted, as I displayed earlier. Call that good right there. Just gonna use the jack on the bottom of our compressor to kind of hold my shock stationary in our compressor. I like to get those started for the most part and then ease out tension on my shock spring. And then we'll tighten it down fully outside of the compressor. But right now, this is safe for us to continue handling. We'll take this, run it the rest of the way in on the table. There we go, that's all finished up. We're gonna put our rubber boot on the top and then get our shock boot pressed back up in here to the hat. It's got a little lip that will press up into your top hat. We're ready to go back on the car. All right, so I've got my anti-seize lubricant here, or bushing grease, and we're just going to put a little bit on the face of the bushing that the lower shock bolt goes through, just to ease our ability to get the shock over this. So we'll just a little bit, just enough to kind of cover the surface. So I've got our assembled shock here, and I've already reinstalled our lift puck, so it's time to go up and into the car. We're gonna do it the same way we came out, so we're gonna start by putting the rear over or the bottom over the axle, and then pushing up on our control arm and pivoting this up and in. Again, a second person may be handy. There we go. All right. So now that we got that in, we're going to get her lined up roughly. And then we're going to put our floor jack under the bottom, or have your buddy pick up on this so we can get our top hat bolts started. And on a factory car without the lift kit, your studs on your top hat would thread right in here and lock yourself into place. Since we have the lift kit with the pucks, we have to use the bolts, which are a little bit more tedious to get lined up. Awesome, now that we have our top shock bolt started, we're going to go ahead and get our bottom shock bolt in. This is the good time to have a buddy around, because you're going to need to push down on your upright while at the same time getting your bolt started for your shock. So we got our lower shock bolt in. A little bit of pivoting and maneuvering of our upright here helped to ease the alignment of that bolt and the lower shock mount. We're gonna get our top hat bolts tightened back down fully now. These are gonna torque to 17 foot-pounds. Before we move back down to the bottom of the car and button everything up, it's a good idea to go ahead and install all of your front plastics, your HEPA filter, your front trunk basket, and your cowl. It's a great idea to go ahead and do that now to save you a trip from getting up and down, save those knees, save those bags. So I've got all my front plastics installed. The last thing to do is gonna be put our front cowl on. And before I put that on, I wanted to show you all something. So this little clip right here, you'll have one on either side. These guys are very prone to breaking when you're reinstalling the cowl. So we wanna be very mindful when we are pushing down not to break these clips. I actually prefer to start with these clips to ensure we don't break them, and then work our way the rest of the way around. So now that we're back down in the wheel well, I'm gonna take our front of the floor jack here, and I'm gonna pump up our upright here so that we can get our upper control arm back installed. With that, we'll be pinned back in. And we'll torque this bolt down to 41 foot-pounds. Next up is going to be our sway bar in link. Get that started and through. Looks like we're gonna need our floor jack again to get us fully lined up. And we're gonna grab our 1/2-inch torque wrench with our 6-inch extension, our sway bar nut to 72 foot-pounds. There we go. And now we're going to route our speed sensor back to place, as well as our brake line. And your brake line does have a little locator tab on the bracket to help you get that in position. And then we'll grab our 10 mil and tighten those down. That's gonna wrap it up for our front suspension install. You'll use the same procedure for the other side, but we're gonna move on to the rear and show you how to knock those out. Tools for this install are going to be a torque wrench, a 21 millimeter wrench, a 3/8 socket wrench, a 1/4 drive socket wrench, a 6-inch extension, a 10 millimeter socket, a 17 millimeter socket, a 16 millimeter socket if you are using the lift kit, and a 15 millimeter socket if you are still on stock hardware. We will be using the 16 millimeter socket today. So now that we're back up under the rear, we need to gain access to this bolt right here. This is going to be your lower shock bolt. This plastic control arm cover is blocking our access to that, so it's got one 10 mil head bolt back here, and it will just pivot out. And that will give us access to remove our shock. And we can just set this to the side. So I'm gonna start out by loosening this bolt, but we're not gonna remove it fully. We're just gonna bust it loose. All right, and now we're going to remove our 2 top hat bolts inside the wheel well. So now that we've got our shock bolt loose on the bottom, we're gonna come up top and remove these hat bolts. You got 2 of them behind the fender liner, but we don't need to remove the fender liner to access them. There's one here, and there's one on the opposite side of the shock tower. So you're gonna need your 15 for OEM hardware and 16 if you've got the puck lift installed. And we are just going to remove these guys fully. And with the lift kit, these bolts are not going to come out of the hat fully. They do have a little retaining clip that keeps them mated to the hat itself. So now that we have our hat bolts loose, you can see the shock has got some wobble to it now. We're gonna go ahead and fully remove that lower shock bolt. Just make sure you got a hand on your shock when you pull this bolt out, because your shock is going to want to fall down. And then we are going to let it slide down and pivot our hat out, and then slowly fit our shock back out, being mindful of our quarter panel. And that is your stock shock. So just like the fronts, you've got this rubber boot on the top. We're gonna pop that off, and that gives us access to the 17 mil holding our top hat on. We're gonna go ahead and knock that guy loose and swap over our stock parts. So now that I've got my shock out, we're gonna go ahead and disassemble it. We're gonna knock this 17 mil nut off the top. You may have to grab your shaft here to keep it from spinning, but you can just pull your boot down, get a good firm grip on it, and then just give it a good, just like that, and your shock hat comes off. We'll go ahead and take our boot and bump stop that is inside the boot. If that doesn't come with the boot, make sure to grab that off your old shock. We'll go ahead and take that and put it on our new Coney strut. So we'll slot that up and over, and then we will take and put our top hat back on with our new nut and send it home. Just like the fronts, when your socket stops spinning, that's how you know you're good. But make sure to keep a hand on your strut rod to keep that from spinning and destroying the seals internally. Just like that, we're all good. We'll put our top cap back on. And we're ready to go back up in the car. So we're gonna take our shock and we're going to put it in the same way we came out. So we're gonna start with the bottom and make sure we get that down through our lower control arm, and then bring our hat back up to its holes. Gonna put the lower shock bolt in just to hold the shock up while I am getting these top bolts started. Now that I have my top bolts started, we're gonna go ahead and push this bottom one the rest of the way through and get our nut on the back of it. And then we will torque everything down to spec. We're gonna fully tighten our top ones down and then torque them to 30 foot-pounds. And then we're going to go ahead and tighten down our bottom one to 85 foot-pounds, but not torque it fully until the car is up at full load and compression. Last thing is going to be putting our lower skid tray back on with the 110 and then getting an alignment. And that's gonna wrap up our install. You'll do the same procedure for the other side. That's gonna do it for our install today. If you like what you see, do leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section down below. And don't forget to check us out at tsportline.com.